Hello, good morning, and welcome to the next episode of Dawsons Auctioneers podcast. This is episode number 5, and these are recollections and reflections of an auctioneer and valuer. I suppose I'd better start at the beginning, well, for me anyway. When I first started out, I worked at the local auction house and worked there quite happily in the Black Country. And I started off as a porter, as you do. That used to be the rite of passage. You start off as a porter, and you work your way up, and you start. They, in my lowly position, I worked in an auction house in Wolverhampton, and as the beginner, as the sort of rookie, as it were, to use an American term, you used to get all the sort of menial tasks, and so you'd be dropped off. We did a lot of work in Shropshire and Staffordshire, and we did quite a lot of big houses and country estates. And what they would do is they would drop you off. We did a lot of house sales, which is where you actually move in lock, stock, and barrel to the house. You catalogue, photograph in situ, and then you sell it in situ and do a walk through. They used to drop you off, and it used to be my job to get the linen together and the apparel. Back in those days, auctioneers used to sell the apparel, and it used to be quite comical because I was in charge of doing the apparel and getting together the lots, grouping the lots together for the apparel and the bedding and the kitchen items and items in the sheds and garages. And so a lot entry in those days might be, 4 pairs of gentlemen's heavy brogues, size 7, 2 brown, 2 black, and things like that. Large quantities of Kilner jars. But you meet all sorts of people. I remember being dropped off in Bridge North one day. I think I was about 15, and I had ostensibly gone to pack up some Worcester porcelain, some 18th century Worcester porcelain. They dropped me off ahead of time, and then the van would pick me up on the return journey, you see, with porcelain packed. And it was in Bridge North, and I knocked on the door with a crate and some packing material and introduced myself. I'm James, and I've come from the auction house at the time. And this lady looked at me rather strangely, and she said, okay, come in. And she said, it's all in the cellar. And I thought, strange place to keep porcelain. So I said, okay, fine. So from the doorway to the right was a sort of a boarded door, sort of a planked door. And she opened it. And she said, it's down there, down the steps. Mind how you go. She turned the light on. I carried the boxes down. Next thing I know, the door had been slammed and the bolt slid across. And I was hammering on the door for Billy-O. And the lady was shouting at me through the door, I don't know who you are, you're an imposter. And I spent a couple of hours there until the van came back to pick me up. And the chap, Darryl at the time, who was the salary manager who was driving the van, knocked on the door and asked if I was ready to come back. Luckily, he'd seen my clipboard on the floor just near the door to the cellar. And the lady said, no, there's no one here of that name. I was panicking. I was in the cellar. The lights were off. I was drumming on the door, and then I think he understood, reading between the lines, that lady was a little bit confused. And he said, "That sounds like James." When I heard his voice, I started drumming on the door even harder. And she said, "Oh yes. Who is that? Who is it?" And he said, "Oh, he came. Do you remember this morning to pack up the porcelain?" "Oh yes, is that him?" And it was. And I'd spent 2 hours in a dank cellar, locked in, which was one of the things that sticks in my mind from early recollections of auction houses. We used to do a lot of house sales, and they were quite interesting because you literally move in lock, stock, and barrel. We did one at a large country house out in Staffordshire. And this chap had actually, I think it was his father, had built a citadel inside the country house with reinforced walls. And he believed, you see, that the Nazis were going to invade Britain, which it could have happened. And what would have happened was he would have held up in this citadel, and this would have been his last stand. And he'd got his gun cabinet in there with his shotguns and things. But we find all sorts of things. Going forward, I say recently, within the last 10 years, I was in Oxfordshire, I got a call from a chap who said he'd got a cottage, and would I pop in and see some of the things? And I said, yes, of course, if you just give me the address. He said, it's probably easier if I come in and see you. So the chap came in and he said, I said, well, what's the address? And he said, well, it's easier if I just meet you. I said, okay. Anyway, he gave me vague directions and he said, I'll meet you in a lay-by. And I'm thinking, well, meeting in a lay-by, it seems highly suspicious. So, I thought, well, in for a penny. So I met him at the allotted time, and he'd said this because there was no vehicle access to this cottage. And from the lay-by, you could see, it's off a country road, you could see a path, a worn path with nettles higher than I am tall, which isn't difficult. And this chap was a very tall chap. Anyway, we went into this valley in the Warwickshire, Oxfordshire borders, and there was this idyllic cottage stuck on the hillside, side of this valley. And we went in there and he showed me around. And this chap had moved to France. And he said, right, well, how quickly could you clear the property? And I said, well, as soon as you give us warning, I can give you a schedule and we can clear it from there. A week or so went by and I thought, I hadn't heard anything. A couple of days later, this chap phoned me and he said, well, the keys are with an estate agent. You can pick them up from there. And I'd like you to clear the property, please. Standard stuff. So I duly collected the keys. I met the transport man who wasn't best pleased because everything in the cottage had to be transported by hand down a valley, up a rutted track, and through this field of nettles. So anyway, I went to make the introduction for the removal man and set the job going. Went back to the Sarum to do some cataloguing. Anyway, about midday, I got a phone call from the removal man, very good chap. And he said, right, well, we've got the first load on. What do you want to do about the things in the shelter? And I said, I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about, shelter. And he said, in the bomb shelter. And I said, are you winding me up? He said, no, there's a nuclear bomb shelter underneath. And I remember when I was going around the house, in the kitchen, they had sort of flagstones. And one of the flagstones had a recessed sort of circular fold down handle. And I just thought it was for the cellar. Apparently not. Apparently it was a fully equipped fallout shelter. I've never seen anything quite like it. And you pulled the ring, and there's the flagstone was a thin veneer of flagstone. And then you had the metal door that was under that. And as you lifted that, a sort of T-bar effect came up. And you had a ladder going down. German built, probably in the 80s. It was just incredible. Doors, sort of oval doors with sort of large handles on them. A filtration system down there. And the strange thing is that it appealed to my impish sense of humour that down there were a large thousands of gallons capacity water tank, but in the and sleeping quarters for 4 people. There was an escape tube which was very interesting through this sort of almost submarine type door, and that went down a sort of corrugated tube big enough to stand up in, and that came to a false storm drain, which is further down the valley. So I think the idea was that if the house got flattened, or the cottage got flattened, then you would escape down this tunnel and pop up out of the storm drain, you see, to a devastated world, no doubt. And the thing that made me laugh was the fact that this was a state, I guess it would have been state-of-the-art Cold War fallout shelter. And for supplies, there were 30 odd bottles of wine and a tin of tuna. So quite what they were planning for, I'm not really sure. So they're just a few stories. If I have to say, if someone told me the story about the bomb shelter, I'd say, yeah, of course it was, yeah. But since I've been here, the same removal guy delivered some items for a client of mine in Oxfordshire, and just to prove it wasn't bunkum, I said, "Graham, do you remember the bomb shelter?" And he rattled it off, chap from verse. These things really do happen, but seemingly only to me. Thank you very much.